And welcome back to Space Thoughts. This is actually going to be a continuation of the last video I did on fractional orbital bombardment and in relation to discussing what FOBs are and in relation to the tests that the PRC apparently looks like actually tested back in August. At the end of that video, I basically came out and said that that test did not violate the Outer Space Treaty. In other words, Article 4 of the Outer Space Treaty that prohibits the placement of nuclear weapons in orbit or stationing them otherwise. I said basically no, it doesn't violate that. And I didn't go into detail on that because a lot of that was really covered in my briefing letter that I put out a few days earlier. What I'm going to do with this video is I'm going to go a little bit deeper into why I don't think it violates the Outer Space Treaty, why that test doesn't violate the Outer Space Treaty, or why FOBs don't violate the Outer Space Treaty. And I'm going to discuss Article 4 a little bit in terms of nuclear weapons and nuclear weapons in outer space, because I think there's a lot of confusion in terms of how, the relation of nuclear weapons in outer space. I mean, when you talk about nuclear weapons in outer space, people automatically say, boom, they're prohibited. Well, they're prohibited in some respects, but in other respects, they're not. So I'm going to try and discuss that in the context of how the Outer Space Treaty was interpreted based on what was actually negotiated versus what people want to interpret it as. So we're going to get right into this, and we're going to go back into time a little bit to the Johnson administration with Secretary McNamara when this issue came up, when the first issue, when FOBs really came up. Now, I'm going to preface this by saying the Soviet Union didn't basically started testing FOBs in the early 60s, even while the Outer Space Treaty was being negotiated. So they knew so the U.S. knew these weapons were being tested, or this delivery system was being tested. And in fact, at the same time, the U.S. was testing ballistic missile defense that actually had a nuclear warhead. In other words, it would basically this ABM system would intercept an incoming ICBM warhead while it was still outside the atmosphere, probably, quote, in space. So, in other words, both sides were really developing these weapons that would potentially carry nuclear weapons or operate nuclear weapons in outer space. So this was all in mind, as well as were ICBMs, while the Outer Space Treaty was being negotiated. And we have this thing called, that both sides agree, no, we don't want no bombs in orbit. I'm going to try and explain what I think that meant in context of what the negotiations of the Outer Space Treaty said, as opposed to what people just basically knee-jerk think it automatically means. And again, this all comes down to interpretation. And I'm going to preface this saying a reminder that treaties are basically contracts, and there are certain rules for interpreting treaties. I mean, the U.S. recognizes certain interpretation rules as customs versus the plain text, the negotiations and intent behind the words during the negotiation of the treaty, and other matters. And this is actually codified in the Vienna Convention, but the U.S. isn't a party to that. But they do recognize the precepts of the Vienna Convention as a matter of customary international law versus actually ratifying a treaty. So we're going to get right to it, because this is going to probably be a longer video than usual. All right. Fundamentally, what we're talking about is Article 4, Paragraph 1 of the Outer Space Treaty. State parties to the treaty undertake not to place in orbit around the Earth any objects carrying nuclear weapons or any other kinds of weapons of mass destruction, install such weapons on celestial bodies, or station such weapons in outer space in any other matter. Now, this I took directly from the LBJ files, and actually this was part of a statement from Secretary McNamara at the time when he was making the interpretation of the Outer Space Treaty. And as I remind you, basically what happened was the Soviets tested a FOBs right after right at the point that the Outer Space Treaty was coming into force. And there was a big hullabaloo about, oh my gosh, this is a violation of the Outer Space Treaty. We got to, but they just signed it and they just violated it with testing this FOBs weapon. And so Secretary McNamara took a step back and basically said, no, they didn't. And basically he took the Article 4 and put it up there and basically underlined these texts. And what he did was he basically took the plain text of the treaty of Article 4 in analyzing this, but he also conferred with Ambassador Goldberg, who basically was very prominent in negotiating the Outer Space Treaty on the behalf of the United States, and basically talked to him and asked him, okay, during negotiations, what was the intent behind these words? What was the real intent? And through that, he kind of backwalked it and said, basically said, FOBS, no, this FOBS test does not violate the Outer Space Treaty, but FOBS don't violate the Outer Space Treaty otherwise. So basically so again, just to remind you, what FOBS does basically is it launches from a point. It will usually come up. It's basically designed in a sense maybe to come across the South Pole and strike a target. So it's really going into a very low orbit, probably about 100 miles, versus the ICBM, which goes up to about 800 miles and then drops down on a ballistic trajectory. And if you remember that from the last video, in fact, if you go back to the last video, I give a good explanation of this with more illustrations. But FOBS doesn't technically create a full orbit. So in essence, here's the problem. There isn't a full orbit. So how does that apply to the Outer Space Treaty? So basically what McNamara did is he took the text of the treaty, talked to Ambassador Goldberg, and looked at what the intent of the negotiations were. And basically he said, no, FOBS don't, this test does not violate the Outer Space Treaty. And two, even a FOBS system, an active FOBS system, won't violate Article 4 of the Outer Space Treaty. Because one, FOBS don't place nuclear weapons in orbit. In other words, because it's going into a fraction of an orbit, it actually falls out of orbit or deorbits before it completes one orbit. And I'm going to jump right to three. There was no evidence the test carried a nuclear weapon. In other words, this was a test of a delivery system, not a weapon system or a nuclear weapon. In other words, it was a delivery system versus an orbital platform. And since the Outer Space Treaty doesn't prohibit the testing and development of weapons designed to carry nuclear weapons, in other words, nuclear delivery weapon systems, the test didn't violate the Outer Space Treaty. So this was eventually the interpretation that the Johnson administration, the policy position they took on the interpretation that they presented, and they got everybody else on board, because there was a lot of kerfuffle about the idea of, well, it's either a partial orbit or this is placing a nuclear weapon in orbit. And McNamara basically said no, based on the plain language of the Outer Space Treaty and based on our negotiations with the Soviet Union, Article 4 doesn't apply to FOBS. And like I said, a lot of this was probably going through the mind of the Soviets too when they were negotiating the treaty. They were also testing this system, and they were mindful of keeping this outside of Article 4. So fundamentally, what the Johnson administration did is it put FOBS into the section, basically in the same category as ICBMs. They're really not they don't violate the Outer Space Treaty. In fact, they don't even fall within the Outer Space Treaty in the way I see it. And that's kind of controversial, because I've seen some articles and commentary just this past week basically saying, well, we got to basically call out China for violating the Outer Space Treaty. They didn't, and I think bottom line is this policy position basically holds that out, this interpretation of the Outer Space Treaty. And I did some research on successive administrations to the extent that I could, given limited access, and depending on what documents were still classified, that basically this appears to still be the policy position of the United States. Now, I'm not saying this is the policy position of the United States, but based on my research, this interpretation of the Outer Space Treaty of Article 4 appears to be a consistent policy right up to the present. So, how do we address the Chinese hypersonic FOBS test? Well, we'll look back to what the McNamara administration basically analyzed. First, basically, let's go to Article number 3. There is no evidence the test carried a nuclear weapon. In other words, we know that they basically tested we were very sure they tested a nuclear delivery system, a fractional orbital bombardment system. But the question is, was there a nuclear warhead on it? And chances are there wasn't. I mean, the intelligence, our intelligence assets may have looked into this, but if they found evidence of a nuclear weapon, that's obviously remained in the classified world, and probably rightly so. But otherwise, there is no evidence that there was a nuclear weapon. So therefore, since the Outer Space Treaty doesn't prohibit the testing and development of weapons designed to carry nuclear weapons, there was no violation. They were just merely testing a delivery vehicle. Now, I'm not downplaying the significance of this test because, as I said last time, I think this demonstrates a weapon that could be a potential first strike capability. But the idea is this is just a test of a weapon. There was no nuclear weapon on board. And even if there was a nuclear weapon on board, FOBs do not place nuclear weapons in orbit under the test or under the interpretation articulated by the McNamara administration. So therefore, even if there was a nuclear weapon on board, it still wouldn't violate the Outer Space Treaty. So this is why I say, and why I've been basically repeatedly saying over again, that this FOBs test didn't violate the Outer Space Treaty, and even when they deploy the system, it still doesn't violate the Outer Space Treaty because it's not designed. This system will not put it into a full orbit. Now, I've seen some conversations about, that, well, this test actually probably created a full orbit. In other words, it did create one full orbit. Well, if that's the case, and if the system's actually designed to perform one or multiple orbits, the test still wouldn't have violated the Outer Space Treaty because the Outer Space Treaty doesn't prohibit the testing and development of weapons designed to carry nuclear weapons, and there was no evidence the test carried a nuclear weapon, unless there's some classified intelligence that says otherwise, and then it's a policy decision on behalf of the Biden administration whether or not to actually make a stink about this. I mean, that again, and I want to emphasize, all these interpretations that I'm rattling off here are basically policy positions. The lawyers have the input on what the interpretation should be, but it's a policy decision on what interpretation is going to be held out in terms of international law. So I think this is really critical, not just for for the Chinese test, but just to understanding that Article 4 is very, very limited in terms of nuclear weapons. I mean, when I talk to people about nuclear weapons and Article 4, or if the topic comes up, it's like boom, the minute somebody says a nuclear weapon, it automatically gets bumped out. But that isn't really the case, because Article 4 is very, very narrowly interpreted, based on not only the plain text but also the negotiations that were actually had. In other words, what were the intent of the parties when they were coming up with this? So the question is, what if this did complete one orbit? Well, again, like I said, even if it completed one orbit, there's no evidence there was a nuclear weapon on board. So and the Outer Space Treaty doesn't prohibit the testing of this weapon, even though it's potentially designed to carry a nuclear weapon, a nuclear delivery system. Now, that's going to bring us to the issue of, and I'm going to further illustrate this issue with what we call MOBS, multiple orbital bombardment systems. In other words, in this case, the delivery system is launched from Earth and then completes one or more orbits before it actually homes in on its target. And this was something that was studied by both sides back during the Cold War. And the question is, well, like I said, if the Chinese test in particular, like I said, if it had done one or more orbits, it still wouldn't have violated because we don't know if there was a nuclear weapon. However, reading some of these memorandums that have been declassified, there was a lot of consternation about MOBS in the sense because when they looked at the Soviet FOB system, they said this probably has the capability of completing one or more orbits, but we don't know. We don't know how to really address this. Now, this may have been addressed in later time in later discussions, and probably is still classified, but the big idea is we didn't want to rock the boat with this because the big part was we got to really prove if they're going to perform a test with this, we're going to have to prove that they have a nuclear weapon on board in order to say that it was a violation. Now, and herein lies a kicker. Chances are, if you have a weapon that is going to have a nuclear weapon on board and perform one or more orbits before it falls on its target, chances are we're already in a nuclear war, and there's not going to be a referee to blow the whistle and and throw a flag, and basically assign a penalty to the side that launched the FOB. In other words, if God forbid, if something like this were ever to fly in time of war, the Outer Space Treaty is out of the picture anyways, and we're in a totally different category. And I'm not worried about criticize. I don't think anybody would be worried about criticizing a country. Be more more concerned about actually surviving this and whether and how we're going to deal with this, either by a countermeasure or retaliation. So once something like this flies, in my opinion, this whole thing is out. This whole idea of the Outer Space Treaty prohibiting this type of weapon or a multiple orbit weapon is just out the window, anyways. However, I'm going to take this a little bit. I'm going to take this a little bit further. And basically reading those memorandums is very enlightening, and some of the concerns in it. I'm going to even go to a point and say that something like this, a weapon that is designed for multiple orbits, doesn't violate the Article 4 of the Outer Space Treaty too. Now, this is my opinion. I don't want people to people's heads are going to explode right now because I'm saying this, and that's fine. But this is, in my opinion, if you have a system that's actually on the surface of the Earth, and it's launched with a weapon on board, you're in war and it's over with. It's over with. However, if it doesn't have a weapon, it's just a test. That isn't outlawed. So my viewpoint, my interpretation of the Outer Space Treaty, Article 4 in particular, is something like a mob system just basically wouldn't violate the Outer Space Treaty either, because really it isn't based in outer space. It is based on the surface of the Earth. And it's either sitting in a silo or sitting in a sub that's traversing the ocean. But the big thing is it's not really in space. And if it's going to go into orbit, it's probably only got to stay in orbit for a couple of orbits before it falls on its target. Again, I think it's highly impractical because it gives the side that's on the receiving end a lot more time to actually prepare for it and retaliate. But in my opinion, because I would lump mobs right along with FOBs and ICBMs. They fall outside the Outer Space Treaty. And I want to emphasize again, this is my opinion. I don't know what the U.S. government says. They may have a different opinion, and their opinion counts more than mine because they're the ones who make policy. I just sitting here actually, doing a intellectual exercise. But basically, things fall out the Outer Space Treaty. ICBMs fall outside the Outer Space Treaty. FOBs fall outside the Outer Space Treaty. In my opinion, mobs fall outside the Outer Space Treaty. Just because of the simple fact that they're not based in outer space, they are based on the Earth. They are actually based on the planet. So the question is, people go back to this whole idea of, going back to this idea of state, what was this thing intended to actually prohibit? And looking at these documents, these declassified documents, and what the Soviets and the U.S. were really talking about, we didn't want a nuclear weapons platform stationed in outer space. Now, I know there's an argument, and actually a colleague made this, kind of presented this argument a couple days ago, that in terms of mobs, by performing one or more orbits, in a sense, you're basing it there. I think that's kind of a stretch. So I really don't think that's it's an interesting argument, but I don't know if it would really hold water. Because again, to the point where if there's actually a nuclear weapon on board and it's only going to perform a couple of orbits, we're probably in a nuclear war already. And the Outer Space Treaty is the least of our concerns. There are obviously other more important things like survival. But what was this thing designed to do? Well, I think from what I read, basically, I think my understanding is they were concerned about not nuclear delivery systems, land-based nuclear delivery systems, but space-based nuclear weapons platforms. And I'm going to distinguish that a little bit. In my opinion, a delivery system is like an ICBM or a FOBS that basically delivers a warhead through space, for less than one orbit, or even one or multiple orbits before actually dropping it. In other words, it's a weapon that's meant to be used in the time of war, that is actually fired or employed during a time of war. A nuclear weapons platform, for the sake of the Outer Space Treaty, is more along the lines of a platform that is actually deployed, that's carrying nuclear weapons, that is basically in lieu of basing them in a silo or a submarine on a terrestrial base, or like I said, in the ocean in a submarine. So in other words, this platform's sitting up there, and it's basically a deterrent. It's designed as a deterrent or a fail-safe or a last-ditch weapon. That's basically what the whole idea was. And again, reading from these memorandums, is the idea is what the Soviets and the U.S. didn't want to do is they didn't want to contaminate space as far as being, a new platform for nuclear weapons. But we had them on Earth, and Earth that was fine. But we didn't want to use space as it. And in fact, we didn't, for example, even the moon. You couldn't put build a nuclear silo on the moon. As as improbable as that may seem now, it's something that was probably considered. But the idea is the Outer Space Treaty says no, you can't deploy a nuclear weapons on the moon. You can't deploy a platform in orbit. That's my interpretation based on what I read. And again, I think heads are probably going to explode over this just because of the fact that this is probably outside of the norm of what people consider the prohibition in Article 4. So, if you've seen here's a couple of examples of, I think, what the Outer Space Treaty was meant to actually forbid. If you've seen the movie Space Cowboys with Clint Eastwood that came out in 2000, basically the premise was there was a Russian satellite that was coming out of orbit, and guess what it really was? It was a nuclear weapons platform that was placed in orbit during the Cold War to sit there as a deterrent or a fail-safe. In the time of war. In other words, instead of basing these missiles on land, they were also going to base these in space. So obviously, flagrant violation of the Outer Space Treaty. In fact, if you watch the movie, you see James Cromwell looking at the Russian general saying, "That's a treaty violation and a damn big one." Right to his face, and the general was all nonplussed about it. And of course, you have to watch the movie if you haven't already. Kind of entertaining, if anything else. Another one that some of you may not have known is Meteor with Sean Connery and Martin Landau, Natalie Wood, Brian Keith. They had really Carl Malden. They really had a nice full star cast for this, and it was entertaining. It was, I watch it now, and technically it was really challenging. But the premise was there was a meteor coming from Earth that had got disturbed from the asteroid belt, and they needed to intercept this thing. Now, Sean Connery's character was an engineer who basically designed this platform called Hercules, which was a nuclear weapons platform. It had, I think, 12 nuclear missiles on it, 12 actual nuclear missiles with big claws. And the idea was he wanted it facing out to space to basically deter, basically intercept threats like this meteor was doing. But, apparently the Department of Defense got involved and turned it around and pointed at Earth. So even though originally what the intent of this platform was called Hercules is that it was nuclear weapons to intercept meteors, it still was a violation of the Outer Space Treaty because it was placing a nuclear weapons platform in outer space. It was placing nuclear weapons in outer space. And that's the kind of thing that, and again, this is an example of what the Outer Space Treaty Article 4 was meant to prohibit. And of course, in this case, the Russians had a similar platform, and they both get together and they aim their missiles and they defeat the meteor. Very interesting. But again, it was a blatant violation of the Outer Space Treaty, but against that prohibition of what place nuclear weapons. Exactly what the Outer Space Treaty was meant to do it. So to kind of sum it up, the idea is, one, things like FOBs, ICBMs, and even MOBs. These things are land-based, SLBMs, land-based, sea-based, or in submarines. These, in my opinion, don't violate the Outer Space Treaty. And so, even if they, even if they did to the point, where and like I said, an example of a MOB, if it was to make multiple orbits, chances are we're already in war, in a wartime footing, anyways, and we're gonna have more important things to think about than calling up the Kremlin and saying, hey, we got you Kremlin or Beijing, and saying, hey, you basically violated the Outer Space Treaty, because at that point, there's more important things to consider. So, but things like, we saw in Space Cowboys and in Meteor, where there's actual physical platforms out there that are just sitting there and waiting, those clear violation of the Outer Space Treaty. So I want to build on this a little bit and kind of clarify what I think Article 4 means and intends, to the sense as far as goes nuclear weapons. I read an article in the Air Force Journal by a colleague, and he was basically arguing against the idea of X-ray lasers. Now, if you're familiar with the Strategic Defensive Initiative, from the Reagan administration, one of the components that was actually proposed by Edward Teller was this idea of X-ray lasers. The idea is they actually started this project. It was called Project Excalibur, and the idea was you would during a nuclear weapons attack, these missiles, there'd be a missile with this device sitting on top of it, waiting to intercept incoming missiles. So, scenario: there was a Soviet launch of ICBMs and SLBMs. It was detected, and a submarine patrolling carrying this device would launch an SLB, would launch a missile with the X-ray laser system on board. Now, the X-ray laser system what they did is it basically detonated a thermonuclear weapon, a small yield thermonuclear weapon. And just before the device vaporized, a small fraction of that energy would be channeled into X-ray lasers that would fan out and destroy incoming missiles during their boost phase. So this was an interesting idea, and this really got President Reagan excited, I guess, and really started, pushing the idea of SDI. There were some experiments with it, but obviously, it very complicated thing. I don't, obviously any results are still classified, so I'm not going to, tell you I'm not going to be able to tell you that it worked or it didn't work. But this is the idea. Now, there was criticism about this. Well, this basically saying, well, this violates the Outer Space Treaty because it's the operation of a nuclear weapon in outer space. And based on what I've read from the Johnson administration memorandums that I've been referring to, and looking back on what the true intent of Article 4 was, my response is no. Basically, this type of weapon wouldn't have been banned. And again, the only time you would use this weapon is if there was an actual nuclear attack, at which point you're in war anyways, and the Outer Space Treaty is pretty much out the window because we are into a whole different territory altogether. And there's no referee to blow the whistle and throw the flag and issue a penalty. It's just going to be too late. If you're going to use this type of system, it's already going to be too late. Another example of operating a nuclear weapon in outer space is Project 437. Now, what happened was back during the Kennedy administration, when the Soviets first started testing FOBs, the question was, what's the best way to intercept these? And they figured the best way to do it would be to use an anti-satellite weapon. And basically what Program 437 did was on Johnston Island, they deployed Thor rockets with a nuclear weapon on board. And what would happen is once these FOBs were detected coming from south, the Thor rocket would launch, and it wouldn't go up in orbit, it would go up into space. And I'm going to use space in quotes. I don't want to get dragged into the definition of space in this video, but it would basically detonate in proximity of the warheads. And the idea is not the blast itself would basically destroy the warheads, but actually the electromagnetic pulse and neutron flux from the detonation would actually fry the guidance systems on the nuclear warheads, which means they couldn't actually deorbit and come down and hit their target. So in other words, fry the guidance systems. So the big thing is that was an operation of that. This would have operated a nuclear weapon. It didn't operate a nuclear weapon during testing. And again, it just tested this concept. But the idea is during a war, this system would have been deployed. There would have been a nuclear explosion in outer space. And again, it wasn't placing anything in orbit. And again, we're in wartime. And the only time this is during wartime. Because of that, the Outer Space Treaty isn't really going to apply. It isn't going to count. No referee to blow the whistle and throw the flag and issue a penalty because we're at war. That would have done. Now, one of the reasons, there were multiple reasons why Program 437 was stood down, but it was never because it was considered a violation of the Outer Space Treaty. I mean, there was concern about the nuclear weapon from the perspective that, if we mistakenly use this system, in other words, we see something coming in and we think it's a FOBS, and we actually use this system and detonate a nuclear weapon in there, that's going to cause us problems politically. It's going to cause a lot of damage up there. You remember the Starfish Prime projects. There's actually, this idea was basically based on experiments like Starfish Prime. This is going to cause us a lot of problems. So we better, get rid of the nuclear weapon idea. And there was actually an idea of doing what we call Program 439, taking the Thor rocket and actually putting a conventional warhead that would have basically used shrapnel, tungsten rods to try and intercept the warhead physically. In other words, just shatter it before it had a chance to deorbit and re-enter. So but the idea is Program 437 didn't violate the Outer Space Treaty. Again, it was land-based, and it would operate it was intended to operate a nuclear weapon in outer space, not place it, carry it, or permanently or station it in anticipation of war. And I think that, and I really think that's the distinguishing this. What you do is distinguishing, whether a weapon is actually a nuclear weapon is actually how can you say violating the Outer Space Treaty. In other words, all these systems that we've been talking about, Soviet FOBs, Chinese FOBs, ICBMs, MOBs, these are all going to be land-based systems. In other words, land-based in anticipation of a war. If you're going to put a platform up there in permanent orbit in anticipation of war with nuclear weapons, then it's going to be a violation of the Outer Space Treaty. And again, this is my opinion, my I guess you could say the way I look at it, the way I analyze it, based on what I've read, and based on what I've read has been negotiated between the Soviet Union and the United States. So that's quick and dirty discussion of Article 4 of the Outer Space Treaty. I know a lot of heads are probably going to explode over this, because really it's not it's basically an interpretation based on a policy decision made back right after the Outer Space Treaty was enacted and put into force. And but like I said, I have seen nothing in the research I've done. I've seen nothing to say that tells me that the U.S. government has backed off from this. Nothing that's been declassified anyways. Again, I can't say for what's actually classified. And you know what? They could have probably changed this. But in my opinion, based on what I've researched, this is why the Outer Space Treaty does not apply to FOBs. It doesn't apply to the Chinese tests that occurred back in August, and basically tries to, the intent was basically try to, clarify this idea of Article 4. Because, again, like I said, when you talk about nuclear weapons in outer space, people automatically jump out, oh my God, Article 4, what nuclear weapons are prohibited from outer space, which kind of makes me think, there's also a little thing in there, and I'll go back to that really quick. Or any other kinds of weapons of mass destruction. So, in other words, it isn't just nuclear weapons, that permanently basing nuclear weapons up in there. And I was kind of thinking about this the other day when I was formulating this video. In other words, if there's a non-nuclear weapon up there that could basically create the same kind of havoc that a nuclear weapon would in terms of destruction, the Outer Space Treaty might actually prohibit that, and it went back to this idea of rods from God, which basically was an idea, and still is an idea, to base in orbit a station with projectiles made of tungsten about the size of telephone poles, and basically what they would do is these would launch from the station onto targets on Earth and destroy a target by sheer kinetic force. Now, when you have a tungsten rod going through the atmosphere, a lot of it's going to survive, and it's going to be coming in pretty hot and fast, and when all that kinetic energy finally realizes itself onto a target, you're going to get a pretty hefty explosion, and probably with an energy release of a small tactical nuclear weapon. So, fundamentally, possibly, theoretically, the rods from God concept, if it was ever deployed, could be considered a weapons of mass destruction. But then again, it depends on how you define weapon of mass destruction. There's a lot of debate about that. A lot of papers have been written, and it all depends on how you define it. But I thought that was an interesting thought that I had with regards to a conventional weapon being deployed in orbit as well. Again, this is the issue that I did on the Pressy on the Chinese FOBs test, talked about FOBs. And basically what I've put out here is what I'd have written here. This is a lot more detailed and such, and it does give you some more my insight, I think, in some of the policy decisions that were being considered when the Johnson administration took this position with the Outer Space Treaty and Article 4 in particular, and FOBs. So again, www.thepressy.net if you want to subscribe. It's like I said, it's four quarterly issues, special issues like this in between. These are pretty much random. I don't have any set number of special issues that I do each year. But if you want to subscribe to it and basically see what some of my insights are, this would be a good place to do it. So that's my video on the Outer Space Treaty, FOBS, Article 4, nuclear weapons, what have you. Again, it's really it is a gloss of the topic, but this explains. But I wanted to explain my position with regards to my comment that the Chinese test did not violate the Outer Space Treaty. And again, like I said, this isn't just something I'm pulling out of my hat. This is actually, something that this is actually backed up by actual policy documents. And like I said, as far as I know, that the policy that the Johnson administration put into place as far as interpreting Article 4 is still in place today. So again, that's all I have for this one. Safe, and I hope you're healthy, and we'll talk to you next time.